South Melbourne, July 2007. The storage facility is about as innocuous and anonymous as a place can possibly be. The coldness from the concrete on this typical Melbourne winter morning somehow making its way through the soles of the Sydney detective shoes. Their socks too, showing little sign of resistance. They can't wait to get out of here and fly back home. They stride past rows and rows of identical orange roller doors, with only small brass numbers to distinguish one from another. It's number 35 they're after. It was rented more than 20 years ago and has been paid for, quietly and reliably, ever since. The man who rented it has been in psychiatric detention since 1969, making him one of Australia's longest-serving prisoners. He's killed at least once a 12-year-old girl on a beach in Victoria, and police have long suspected that he's killed many more times than that. They open the door. Inside number 35, coincidentally, perhaps a bit eerily, are 35 boxes. The detectives get to work, opening them one by one. Inside they find diaries, years of them, handwritten, their pages dense with violent fantasy. There's drawings, newspaper clippings about child abductions and sex crimes. There's maps with locations marked. And then in one of the boxes, something that stops the detective cold. A pornographic cartoon, hand-drawn, and across the top of it in careful handwriting a single word. Wanda. Beneath it in the same box on a separate sheet, a street map. The detectives look at it for a moment, then one of them recognises the suburb. West Ryde. The suburb where Marianne, Schmidt and Christine Sharrock had lived, where they had caught the train on the morning of January the 11th, 1965. Where their families were still waiting, 42 years later, for an answer. Struth. Welcome back to the show. This is part 2 of our investigation into the Wanda Beach murders. The 1965 killings of 15-year-old best friends, Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock, in the sandhills behind Cronulla's Wanda Beach. If you haven't heard part 1, I'd recommend starting there. It tells the story of the day itself, the 4 younger children left waiting in the wind, the mysterious boy with the blue towel, and a drag mark in the sand. This episode is about what came after 6 decades of investigation. 3 credible suspects. DNA evidence that materialised after 47 years and then, 2 years later, vanished. And it's about the families who are still waiting. Before we get to the suspects, though, we need to reanalyse a key component of this story that we touched on in part 1. An element that's never been explained. Something that I believe sits at the centre of this case like a locked room that nobody's ever managed to open. Christine Sharrock, for a small period of time, left the group. As you remember from part 1, while the 6 of them were sheltering among the rocks at the southern end of Cronulla Beach, after Marianne had taken Wolfgang for his swim, after the picnic was laid out, Christine stood up and walked away. She didn't say where she was going, at least not within earshot of the youngsters, and she was gone for an unknown period of time. When she came back, nobody asked her where she'd been, or if they did, no account of her answer was ever recorded. Importantly, the autopsy told investigators what the younger children couldn't. Christine had eaten food that wasn't part of this group's picnic. Something containing cabbage and celery, most likely a Chico roll from one of the beachfront kiosks. In addition, her blood alcohol content registered at 0.015. A modest amount, definitely. The equivalent of perhaps one beer, maybe just a few swigs. But it was measurable, it was present, and it is unexplained. We can only assume that someone bought Christine Sharrock a drink, or gave her some of theirs. Because 15-year-old girls in January 1965 didn't typically walk into a beach kiosk and order alcohol alone, and have the attendant serve them without remark. The more likely reading is that she was with someone older, or at least someone whose presence made the transaction unremarkable. Someone who sat with her long enough for her to eat and drink before she came back to the group. And that person, even with a huge amount of interest and media presence in this case, has never been identified. They've never come forward. In 60 years of investigation and 16,000 interviews, nobody has ever come out and said, "I was with Christine Sharrock on the afternoon of January the 11th, and here's what happened." No innocent explanation of those things being in her system has ever come to light. And you'll also remember that later that afternoon, after the group had walked north and the younger children had stopped to shelter behind a sandhill 400 metres from the Wanda Surf Club, Marianne told the children she and Christine were going back south to collect the bags. And then, inexplicably, the girls turned north, walking further into the dunes, away from the bags, away from the children, away from the beach. Even when Peter had pointed out this mistake, yelling out, "You're going the wrong way," Marianne simply turned, looked over her shoulder, and laughed. But they kept moving. Dennis Dostine, a local fireman walking in the area with his son, was the last named person to see them alive. He saw them at roughly 12:45, moving quickly, somewhere between 730 and 800 metres north of the surf club. They appeared to him to be in a hurry, and one of the girls, he couldn't say which, kept looking back over her shoulder, repeatedly. The way you do when you're checking whether you've been followed. Were they worried that the little children were following after them? Were they going to do something or meet someone that they didn't want the youngsters to see? Or were they scared, worried about who might be following them up the beach? Several ways to read that image, and 60 years on, we still don't know which reading's correct. But it feels important. So let's move on to our first key suspect, Derek Ernest Percy. Percy was just 16 years old when Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock were murdered. He'd been born in September 1948. And by January of 1965, he was living with his family in the New South Wales town of Jervis Bay. His father was a naval officer. But the Percy family had connections in Sydney. In fact, his grandmother lived on Brush Road, West Ryde, the same street as the Schmidt and Sharrock families. In January 1965, his father travelled to the Sydney area for a yachting regatta held at Botany Bay, just a few kilometres from Wanda Beach. And Derek Percy was with him. Police wouldn't know this for years, and Percy wasn't a suspect in 1965. He was just a quiet teenager from a naval family. Nobody was looking at him. Those connections were only made after what he did in 1969, 4 years after the Wanda Beach tragedy. It was then that Derek Percy abducted 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey from Ski Beach at Warneet in Victoria while she was playing with a friend. He took her to a paddock 8 kilometres away and murdered her. The friend, 11-year-old Shane Spiller, escaped by threatening Percy with a tomahawk. Police arrested Percy hours later at the Cerberus Naval Base, where Percy was washing blood from his clothing. At his trial in 1970, the jury found him not guilty by reasoning of insanity. He was detained indefinitely at Her Majesty's pleasure. He would remain in custody for the rest of his life, 44 years in total, making him Australia's longest serving prisoner. He died in 2013 of lung cancer without ever having been released. In the years after his arrest, Percy's name began appearing in connection with a series of unsolved child murders across 2 states. There was 7-year-old Linda Stillwell, who vanished from St Kilda in 1968. Simon Brooke, 4 years old, taken from Fairy Meadow in 1968. And the Beaumont children, who disappeared from Glenelg Beach in South Australia in 1966. A case that we've covered previously here on Struth. A coroner ruled posthumously in 2014 that Percy had indeed abducted and killed Linda Stillwell. The other cases remain officially open. And when Percy was asked about Wanda Beach, asked whether he could have killed those 2 girls, his answer was as close to a confession as anyone ever got from him. He simply said, "I could have done it, but I can't remember." It's the kind of answer that tells investigators exactly nothing they can use and everything they need to understand about who they're dealing with. In 2004, police established Operation Heats, a multi-jurisdictional cold case task force specifically investigating Percy's suspected involvement in this series of unsolved child murders. They obtained permission to examine the storage unit we took a walk through at the start of this episode. Percy had been renting Unit 35 in the South Melbourne complex for more than 2 decades. And what they found, in July 2007 when they finally opened it, would impact the Wanda Beach investigation for the remainder of Percy's life. 35 boxes. There were diaries, page after page of handwritten, violent fantasy, detailed and specific. The kind of writing that's impossible to read with any level of detachment. There were newspaper clippings too, about a wide variety of child abductions and sex crimes, carefully cut and kept. There were drawings, and there were maps marked with locations that corresponded to crime scenes across New South Wales and Victoria. And there was that pornographic cartoon with the word Wanda written across it in careful handwriting. And beneath it, the street map of West Ryde, near the railway station where Marianne and Christine had caught their train. Like we said though, his grandmother did live on the same street as the 2 girls. So this could well have been part of a larger coincidence. There was also a short piece of fiction, a story handwritten by Percy about killing 2 girls at a beach called Barnsley, a location in coastal New South Wales. And there was also detail in his diaries that made investigators very still when they found it. Percy had written about forcing a victim to consume alcohol before an attack. Christine Sharrock's autopsy had registered a blood alcohol content. DNA was eventually obtained from Percy before his death in 2013. A comparison with Wanda Beach evidence, semen samples taken from 1965, and some weak male DNA profile extracted from Christine Shorts in 2012, has never been publicly disclosed. New South Wales Police have never confirmed whether Percy was included or excluded based on a comparison of those samples to his DNA. He died on July 17, 2013 of lung cancer, and he took whatever he knew with him. And speaking of that semen sample, in July 2014, New South Wales Police made contact with the Schmidt family. The sample taken from Marianne's body, recovered from the crime scene in 1965, held for 49 years, was gone. Police had searched. They'd conducted what was described as an extensive search, and it couldn't be located. In 2017, the Daily Telegraph published an investigation revealing that evidence from more than 50 unsolved New South Wales homicide cases had gone missing or been discarded over decades of storage. So Wanda Beach wasn't alone. There were 50 families, 50 cases, 50 sets of questions that could now never be answered by the evidence that had once been there. Hans Schmidt, who had been 13 years old when his sister was killed, who'd been shown photographs of her body by police investigators, who'd spent more than half a century carrying that weight, said at that point that he no longer believed the case would ever be solved. "Find the guy," he told a journalist, "and I'll pull the trapdoor myself." However, the weak DNA sample from Christine Shorts, the one remaining thread, still exists. As of today, it's never been matched. It remains on the file waiting, as this entire case has always waited for something to move. And that brings us to our next suspect. In 1969, a 24-year-old man emigrated from Sydney to Miami, Florida. He was leaving behind a city he'd grown up in, a beach culture he'd been part of all his life, and a police file that was marked suspended, meaning the detectives who should have interviewed him had failed to do so before he left the country. His name was Christopher Wilder, and he would become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But Wilder was born in Sydney in 1945, and by January 1965, when Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock were murdered, he was 19 years old and living on Sydney's northern beaches. He was the kind of young man who spent his weekends on the beach, tanned and comfortable near the water. He also had a conviction from a 1963 gang rape of a 13-year-old girl at a quarry near Freshwater Beach. That conviction and his proximity to Wanda on the day of the murders was enough for detectives to put his name in the file as a person of interest. So let's think about what we know of Christine's absence, the one I highlighted at the start of this episode. Someone sat with a 15-year-old girl long enough for her to eat a meal and consume a drink. Someone who, to her at least, didn't seem threatening. Not just to Christine, but not to anyone watching. Someone who perhaps presented himself as friendly, safe. The kind of person you'd accept a drink from on a beach on a hot January day. Christopher Wilder's established pattern, both in Australia and later in America, fit this profile perfectly. He approached young women. He was personable, good-looking, easy in the company of strangers. He often offered them things, a drink, a meal. A modelling contract was one of the things that he kept going back to time and time again with his victim. If anyone could have sat with Christine during her absence and seemed like nothing to worry about, Wanda fixed that picture. And let's hypothesise for just a moment. What if he organised with Christine to meet her further north in the dunes at a specific time later that afternoon? All of a sudden, the evidence given by Dennis Dostine, the young girls moving quickly, continuing to look over their shoulder, maybe they were hurrying, maybe they felt as though they were late for some pre-planned appointment to meet someone further north on the beach. It paints a very different picture. A picture that lines up quite carefully with Christopher Wilder's MO. When Wilder married in 1968, his wife left him after a single week. She told police why. She raised her concerns about his violent nature and his potential connection to the Wanda Beach murders specifically. He was on their persons of interest list. But police took 9 months to follow up, and by the time they did, Wilder was gone. In America. Out of reach. His file was marked suspended. In 1982, Wilder returned to Australia to visit his parents, and while he was here, he was charged with sexual offences against 2 15-year-old girls he'd lured from Manly Beach. He fled back to the United States before the matter could proceed. In early 1984, over the course of 6 weeks, he abducted and murdered 8 women across 16 American states before dying in a confrontation with police in New Hampshire on April the 13th. Retired Detective Inspector Ian Waterson, who led the Wanda Beach cold case investigation, was asked point blank who he believed was responsible, and he didn't hesitate. In my mind, he said, it would have to be Christopher Wilder, because there are so many signs pointing to this man. His sexual deviancy, his propensity for violence, his presence in Sydney at the time, and his habit of hanging around beaches and luring young girls. The Schmidt family was never told about Wilder during the original investigation. They were shown the police documents for the first time during a Channel 7 Sunday night report in 2018. Marianne's younger brother Bert watched it unfold on the screen. The file, his sister's name on it, Wilder's name beside it, the 9-month delay, the suspended notation. And he said what many people watching were thinking. That's crap. What did the cops do? Christopher Wilder is dead. He can't be interviewed, charged or tried. The question of whether he murdered 2 15-year-old girls in the Sydney sand dune in January 1965 will never be settled in a courtroom. Ian Waterson, a man who spent more time perhaps than anyone thinking about this case, believes it was him. Although other investigators are less certain, the file, according to them, remains open. This brings us on to our third, and perhaps least likely suspect. Alan Bassett was convicted in 1966 of a rape and murder of 19-year-old Carolyn Orphan. He'd met her at a Wollongong dance, offered her a lift home and driven her instead to Mount Owsley on the outskirts of the city, where he attacked and killed her. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1975, 10 years into his sentence, Bassett asked to speak with Cec Johnson, a detective who had worked the Wanda Beach case, and he gave Johnson a painting, a landscape rendered in oil, abstract in places, figurative in others, the kind of work that could be read many ways. And Cec Johnson, the detective, looked at it for a long time. What he believed he saw in that painting were details that only the Wanda Beach killer would know. A configuration of marks in the lower portion of the canvas that mirrored the blood patterns at the crime scene. Something that might be a partially buried figure with one hand raised in a corner. And also what appeared to be a broken knife blade. Johnson became convinced the painting was a confession that couldn't be used in court. He spent years trying to bring other investigators around to his view, and eventually began writing a book setting out his case in full. But he never finished it. Johnson was killed in an accident before the manuscript could be completed or published, and the book exists nowhere. Whatever case he was building, whatever detail or reasoning he had assembled across years of looking at that canvas, died with him. It's important to note that most of his colleagues weren't persuaded anyway. The painting is abstract enough that a determined analyst could read almost anything into it. The other detectives who examined it retained respect for Johnson, while concluding he was wrong. There was no physical evidence placing Bassett at Wanda Beach. There was nothing beyond the painting itself and Johnson's conviction. Bassett was released from prison in 1995. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample, apparently to clear his name. Whether that sample excluded him from the Wanda Beach evidence has never been made public. Cec Johnson went to his grave believing he had seen a confession in that canvas. There's only one man who knows whether he was right or wrong. So to me, we keep coming back to one moment. 12:45 in the afternoon, January 11th, 1965. Dennis Dostein's walking through the Wanda Sandhills with his son, and he sees the two girls moving quickly through the dunes. One of them keeps turning to look back over her shoulder. That image, that backwards glance, what did it mean? Investigators have often thought that it read as fear. Two girls becoming aware of danger too late, already being followed, already hunted. And perhaps that's right. Maybe they were just looking over their shoulder, worried that the younger children were following along the beach. Worrying that they were going somewhere to meet someone that they didn't want the little ones to know about. That particular thread begins not with the dunes, but with a girl standing up from a picnic and walking away without explanation, with a meal that she ate somewhere else, and with a drink that registered in her blood when she was dead. With a specific, deliberate act of telling four younger children you're going south and then walking north. What if they weren't running from something? What if they were going to meet someone? A $20,000 reward still stands. The New South Wales Unsolved Homicide Unit is still active. So if you were at Cronulla Beach, or indeed at Wanda Beach on the 11th of January 1965, if you sat with a 15-year-old girl and gave her something to eat and drink, or if you know who did, the number is 1-800-333-000. The sand dunes are mostly gone now. Houses stand where they once shifted in the southerly. But it's never too late for the truth. It's truth. Thank you so much for listening to this two-part episode into the Wanda Beach tragedy. We'll be back with a very special episode next Wednesday here on Struth. For the first time ever, we're heading across the ditch. You don't want to miss it. Make sure you follow, subscribe, whatever it is you do on your podcasting platform. Thanks for listening.